February 2nd, 1943, near Kursk, western Russia. The air was white with smoke and snow, a silence so sharp it could cut through bone. Broken trucks and shattered helmets lay half buried in the ice. Through the grey haze, a small olive-green vehicle rolled forward, four wheels, canvas roof, flapping its engine, humming like it didn't know it was in a war. The Red Army patrol stopped dead in their tracks. This wasn't one of theirs. It was a jeep, an American machine, still running after the battlefield around it had died. No one spoke at first. Men in frozen coats circled it like wolves around fire. A sergeant wiped the mud off the hood. U.S. Army. He laughed, once the kind of laugh that hides disbelief. How could something so small, so fragile, survive where Soviet steel had failed? The soldiers had dragged home tanks before burnt hulks that coughed smoke for the engineers to dissect. But this thing still breathed its motor, steady as a heartbeat. At Kubinka, the testing grounds near Moscow, they would strip it down, bolt by bolt. The engineers would sneer at first, then fall silent as the truth appeared. Simplicity was the Americans' secret weapon. That night, under a burning red sky, a single thought began to spread through the ranks. Maybe power wasn't about armor at all. War had always rewarded size, fear, and firepower. Yet this little engine from across the ocean had just rewritten the rules. What they found inside would shake everything they believed about engineering strength and survival. If you're ready to uncover that secret the moment the Soviets realized they'd misunderstood mobility itself, like, subscribe, and share this story. Because what happens next will make you question what strength truly means. From the frozen plains of Kursk, the little American jeep began its unlikely pilgrimage east 400 kilometers through snow, mud, and silence toward the proving grounds of Kubinka. Behind it, the battlefield still smoldered. The last artillery shells had fallen hours ago, but their echoes clung to the air like ghosts. Soviet soldiers watched the small machine bounce over ruts and frozen puddles, its olive-green skin scarred by shrapnel, yet somehow untouched by defeat. No one could explain how it was still moving. It had survived a storm of steel that had torn apart tanks twice its size. The temperature dropped below -20. The convoy, hauling the captured jeep, crawled forward across fields glazed with ice, their breath turning to mist beneath the grey Russian sky. Horses slipped, diesel trucks sputtered and froze. Yet the jeep, lashed to the back of a flatbed for the first stretch, didn't stay there for long. When one of the trucks broke down, the soldiers decided to try something absurd. They unloaded the jeep and used it to pull the heavier vehicle out of the drift. The engine coughed once, then caught. It moved. The men laughed in disbelief as the tiny vehicle dragged the crippled Soviet truck forward, tires biting into the snow like a beast refusing to die. For 4 days, the jeep kept moving. It wasn't fast, but it was relentless. When the convoy stopped to rest, the men would huddle around its warm engine, block hands stretched toward its steady hum. In a land where machines often froze before the men did, that hum felt like defiance. They began to call it the Little Yankee. Each village they passed was a scar of war, burned barns, shattered windows, smoke curling from blackened chimneys. Children with hollow eyes watched from doorways as the strange American vehicle rolled by. To them, it wasn't an enemy or an ally. It was something foreign, alive, unstoppable. Even the local mechanics men who could fix tractors with wire and prayer bent over its hood in awe. Everything about it was wrong to them, the size, the simplicity, the lack of armor, and yet it worked. By the second night, the officers in charge of the transport had started keeping a logbook, not of miles, but of failures and the jeep's absence from that list. Soviet gas trucks broke axles. A tracked carrier lost its drive sprocket. The Willys kept going. Its tires, small and thin by Soviet standards, gripped where others slipped. The fuel lines didn't freeze. The starter never hesitated. It didn't leak oil. It didn't complain. The sergeant leading the escort, a man named Grigory Petrov, had seen more engines die than comrades. To him, machines were like people, proud, fragile, and prone to failure under pressure. But this one seemed to carry something different, a kind of quiet confidence. "It doesn't even look military," one of the younger soldiers said as they camped by a frozen stream. Grigory spat into the snow. "That's why it wins," he muttered. "It doesn't know it's supposed to break." On the third morning they reached the outskirts of Kaluga, where the roads dissolved into rivers of thawing ice and ruts deep enough to swallow wheels. Soviet vehicles sank one by one, bogged down by their own weight. The jeep drove around them, light, fearless, floating across the mud like a water beetle. Every kilometre deepened the soldiers' disbelief. The small engine never overheated, the gears never screamed, and the clutch never burned. They began to joke that maybe the Americans had filled it with magic instead of gasoline. When they finally rolled into Kubinka, the proving ground rose like a grey fortress against the winter horizon. Rows of test sheds half buried in snow, surrounded by the skeletons of captured tanks, German Panthers, Italian L-6S, and one burned-out Churchill. Smoke from the workshops curled upward, mixing with the morning mist. The engineers had heard about the jeep's journey, but most expected another pile of Western junk, fragile toys, built for paved roads and easy climates. The soldiers parked it beside a half-dismantled Panzer III. Steam rose from the jeep's hood as the engine idled softly. It was the only sound in that silent courtyard. A few engineers stood watching from the doors, their faces expressionless behind fogged-up glasses. One of them, a thin man in an oil-stained coat named Viktor Andreev, walked forward, brushed his hand across the fender and frowned. "It's still warm," he said quietly. After 400 kilometers, he opened the hood, expecting a mess of delicate wiring and temperamental parts. Instead, he found clarity, every cable labelled, every bolt, reachable, every line of metal purposeful. "It's too simple," he murmured. "It shouldn't work this well." But it did. That night, as frost tightened its grip over Kubinka, the engineers gathered in the dim light of the testing hangar. The jeep sat on the concrete floor, melting a small circle of ice beneath its chassis. Grigory stood nearby, arms crossed, watching them circle it like priests around an idol. He could see the skepticism melting into something else, curiosity. Victor took notes as his team measured clearances, traced wiring, and dismantled sections of the frame. He was a man who believed complexity equaled progress, that every screw and pipe was proof of human intellect. Yet, the more he studied, the more that belief eroded. There were no hidden valves, no over-engineered secrets. Everything served one purpose: to work. When dawn broke, the wind howled against the hangar walls, carrying snow that looked like ash. Victor leaned over the jeep's open hood, the tip of his pencil trembling. "They built this like a tool," he said finally. "Not a monument." The others nodded silently. By the second day of inspection, word spread through Kubinka. Men from other departments came to see it: tank designers, aircraft mechanics, truck specialists. Each found something to envy. The clutch mechanism so simple it could be repaired with pliers. The air filter designed for dust storms but unfazed by snow. The spark plugs, interchangeable, cheap, and impossible to misalign. A colonel from the armoured division arrived that evening, boots echoing on the concrete. He ran his glove across the jeep's hood and turned to Victor. "So, engineer," he asked, "what's your verdict? Is it strong?" Victor hesitated, then gave the only answer that felt true. "It's honest." That night he wrote his first impression in the official report. The American machine displays endurance not through mass or armour, but through balance and simplicity. Its performance across 400 kilometers under severe winter conditions suggests an engineering philosophy, different from our own one, that prioritizes function over prestige. Outside, the temperature dropped even lower. Diesel engines across the base failed to start. Mechanics cursed into the wind, lighting small fires beneath frozen fuel tanks. But in the center of the yard, the captured jeep sat untouched. Its engine turned once, twice, and came alive, steady, indifferent, almost smug. Grigory watched from a window and couldn't help but smile. He had driven countless Soviet trucks that had broken his back and betrayed his trust. Yet this small foreign machine, born from a nation he barely understood, had crossed a land built to kill it. He thought about how the generals would scoff, how the engineers would argue, how pride would resist what they were about to learn. But deep down, he knew the truth already. The journey from Kursk to Kubinka had proven something greater than durability. It had revealed a philosophy, a belief that strength could come from restraint, that a simple thing done perfectly could outlast the complicated done poorly. And for the first time, the men at Kubinka felt the faint, uneasy flicker of doubt that maybe, just maybe, they had been building their machines the wrong way all along. Outside, the snow fell harder. Inside, the Jeep's engine kept running a small, defiant heartbeat in the cold Russian dark, a whisper that said the real test hadn't even begun yet. The next morning, the hangar at Kubinka was alive with noise, the clang of wrenches, the hiss of torches, the low murmur of men trying to understand what they could not yet accept. The captured Jeep stood in the center like a patient on an operating table, its olive skin glinting under the cold lamps. Viktor Andreev stood over it with a clipboard, jaw-clenched eyes narrow behind fogged lenses. "Start from the transmission," he ordered. "If it runs this well, I want to know why." The first bolt came loose with a single twist, then another, then another. The men exchanged looks, no hammering, no cursing, no stripped threads. Every piece obeyed. Within an hour, the Jeep was half disassembled, its heart and bones spread across the steel floor like an anatomy lesson in humility. Victor crouched over the gearbox, brushing away a trace of oil. "Look at this," he muttered. "Herringbone gears, balanced load distribution." The younger engineers leaned closer. Soviet transmissions used straight-cut gears that screamed under strain and shattered when misaligned by a fraction. The American design spread the pressure evenly, whisper quiet, forgiving of imperfection. Victor ran his fingers along the teeth, each cut symmetrical, smooth as glass. "You see," he said, "they built this to survive mistakes." He turned to the others. "Our machines demand respect. This one earns it." They moved on to the clutch assembly. The metal housing opened easily. Inside, no exotic alloys, no precision fittings that required hours of adjustment, just sturdy simplicity. A soldier watching from the doorway laughed. "It looks like a toy," he said. "Then why can't we build toys that work?" Victor shot back without looking up. By midday, the air smelled of oil, frost, and realization. Every discovery chipped away at the engineer's pride. They measured the drive shaft tolerances wide enough to allow for dirt wear and heat expansion. Soviet doctrine demanded microscopic precision. They built for laboratory perfection, not battlefield chaos. The Americans had done the opposite. They had built something that could live in mud. Victor scribbled in his notes, "The secret is not accuracy, it's forgiveness." The team moved to the suspension. Leaf springs, compact and rugged, compressed easily under weight but refused to snap. "They don't fight nature," Victor murmured, testing the rebound. "They work with it." He could feel the pattern now, the same logic everywhere. Build it once, build it right, and make sure it can be fixed anywhere, by anyone. When they opened the air filtration system, the Discovery drew a low whistle from one of the mechanics. A two-stage oil bath filter, primitive, almost crude, yet flawless. Soviet filters clogged within hours in the dust of the steppe. This one had crossed continents and still looked clean. Victor lifted the casing to the light. "Do you understand?" he said quietly. "It's not genius, it's experience. They've been building cars for ordinary men for decades. We've been building machines for parades." The words hung heavy in the cold air. Outside, snow lashed against the windows. Inside, the Jeep lay bare, a testament to a nation's philosophy carved into steel. No part was too precious to replace no component beyond understanding. Victor pointed to the wiring harness. "Uniform connectors," he noted. "Same gauge throughout. No nonsense." Soviet vehicles were riddled with improvisations, wires soldered by hand, each batch different, each repair a gamble. Here, everything fit like a puzzle made by one mind. By evening, the hangar floor was covered with labelled parts. The team gathered around a table where Victor had laid out the tools used for the disassembly. It was a small pile, basic wrenches, screwdrivers, nothing special. "That's all it took," he said. "You could take apart this entire machine in a field, fix it, and be back on the road before sunset." A silence followed. One of the younger men, Pavel, spoke softly. "Comrade engineer, our designs require certified mechanics, weeks of training and factory tools." Victor looked at him. "Exactly. And that's why they win. They don't build machines that need heroes to drive them." For a long time no one said a word. They began the reassembly the next day, partly out of duty, partly out of respect. Every bolt slid back effortlessly. No alignment problems, no lost pins. When they reconnected the fuel lines and turned the ignition, the engine came alive instantly, the same confident growl that had echoed across the battlefield. It idled smoothly, steady as breath. Victor watched the dials, oil pressure, temperature revolutions, all stable. The engine didn't care that it had been frozen, dissected, or doubted. It just did what it was made to do. That indifference felt like strength. During lunch, Victor sat with the senior mechanic Ivan. They ate black bread and smoked cigarettes by the radiator. Ivan blew out a thin stream of smoke. "I've repaired trucks my whole life," he said. "Every one of them breaks like a promise. But this, it feels alive." Victor nodded slowly. "They've built reliability the way we build armor layer by layer, except theirs protects time, not steel." That afternoon they compared the Jeep's frame to that of a GAZ truck brought in for reference. The difference was staggering. The GAZ chassis was heavy, over-engineered, every weld a proud scar of effort. The Jeep's frame was elegant, straight lines, stress evenly distributed, a design that trusted its own simplicity. When they struck it with a hammer, the sound rang clean and solid. Pavel frowned. "We could make this stronger." Victor smiled faintly. "And heavier, and slower, and worse. That's what we always do." The realization hit them all at once. The Jeep wasn't a miracle. It was a mirror. It reflected everything their factories were not efficient, standardized human. They rolled it onto the testing track outside the hangar, engines roaring against the wind. The Jeep started without hesitation, headlights cutting through the dusk. It climbed the snowbank like a goat, spun half a turn, and kept moving. The men cheered despite themselves. Victor didn't. He just watched, hands in pockets, eyes narrowed. The sound of its tires on ice was the sound of inevitability, proof that the war of machines was being fought on a front they had never seen coming. When the test ended, they pushed the vehicle back into the hangar. Its olive paint was streaked with salt and slush, its engine ticking softly as it cooled. Victor turned to his team. "Write this down," he said. "We build for pride, they build for purpose. We chase precision, they chase endurance. We think in terms of perfection, they think in terms of use." He paused, then added quietly, "We build to impress, they build to last." The men wrote the words down, unsure whether they were recording data or confession. That night, Victor stayed behind. He sat on a crate beside the Jeep, the single light bulb above, casting long shadows across the concrete. He traced the steering wheel with his hand, feeling the worn grip left by foreign soldiers, men who had trusted this machine with their lives. He thought of the factories back home, of the endless meetings, the obsession with specifications, the pride in numbers that meant nothing in the mud. He realized then that this wasn't just an American vehicle, it was an American idea, a belief that ordinary people could handle extraordinary tasks if the tools didn't fail them. It was democracy, translated into engineering. Outside, a blizzard howled. Victor didn't move. The Jeep sat silent beside him, a quiet testament to a different kind of power. He whispered to himself, "We thought complexity was intelligence, but intelligence is making something simple enough to trust." Somewhere beyond, the snow factories in Detroit and Toledo kept building more of these little machines, thousands, tens of thousands, each one as faithful as the first. Victor closed his notebook and stood, his breath clouding in the cold air. Tomorrow they would begin the official report, filled with measurements, temperatures, and mechanical jargon. But he knew what the truth really was. The Americans hadn't just built a vehicle. They had built reliability into steel, patience into pistons, and humility into design. And as he shut off the light and stepped into the freezing night, he understood that every turn of that Jeep's engine was more than motion. It was proof that simplicity done right could change the course of war. The blizzard broke at dawn, leaving behind a Moscow buried under white silence. The city seemed frozen in a single breath, chimneys coughing smoke into the pale air, the sound of distant trucks muffled by snow. At the edge of the capital, beyond the walls of the Kubinka proving grounds, a line of men waited in the cold. Generals in long coats, engineers clutching clipboards, soldiers stamping their boots for warmth. In the center of the yard stood the American Jeep, small and unassuming beside the heavy Soviet vehicles gleaming under frost. Viktor Andreev stood a few meters away, collar turned up, watching his creation by adoption, not with pride but with curiosity. For weeks he had torn it apart and rebuilt it, tested its heart and mind, and still it had never faltered. Now it would face the ultimate test, not of metal, but of belief. The order came just after 9. Marshal Zhukov himself had arrived. His presence carried the weight of victory and judgment alike. The soldiers straightened boots, crunching in unison. Zhukov approached with a steady gait, his breath steaming in the cold, his eyes sharp beneath the fur cap. He stopped before the jeep, studying it without expression. "This," he said, "at last is what all the talk is about." His tone was skeptical, half amused. Victor nodded once. "Yes, Comrade Marshal. The American vehicle captured at Kursk." Zhukov circled it, slowly running a gloved hand along the side panel, his reflection wavering in the olive paint. "It looks fragile," he said. "We'll see if it acts that way." The trial began. The first test was the slope, an incline of frozen earth slicked with ice, one that had humiliated dozens of domestic machines. The GAZ truck went first, roaring with confidence. Halfway up, its tires spun helplessly, spraying slush, its engine screaming before choking into silence. Mechanics rushed forward, slipping, cursing, trying to restart it. Nothing. The sound of failure echoed down the range. Then the jeep moved. Its small engine growled, once low and steady, as if refusing to be provoked. It climbed slowly, almost casually, like it had done this 1,000 times before. Snow kicked out behind its tires, but it never lost traction. Halfway up, it hit the same patch of ice that had defeated the GAZ and kept going. No smoke, no stalling, just quiet persistence. When it crested the top, the crowd didn't cheer. They simply stared, as if something fundamental had shifted in the air. Victor's hands tightened in his coat pockets. He saw it now, the disbelief breaking the pride, beginning to crumble. Next came the frozen river crossing. The engineers had cleared a path across the thin ice, reinforced in spots with planks, but everyone knew it was dangerous. The Soviet armored scout car went first. Its treads cracked the surface, the nose dipped, and the vehicle sank halfway before winches dragged it back, coughing water and shame. The jeep followed. Its driver, a young sergeant with frostbitten cheeks, grinned nervously before shifting into low gear. The little machine glided forward, weight, evenly distributed tires, whispering over the cracking ice. Midway, one of the boards broke, gasps rippled through the crowd, but the jeep's front wheel caught the edge, clawed forward and climbed out. In less than a minute, it reached the opposite bank exhaust, steaming in triumph. The applause started hesitantly, then spread, not loud but sincere. Zhukov said nothing. His eyes followed the jeep as it circled back unbothered, almost arrogant in its simplicity. Then came the artillery tow. A 45mm anti-tank gun sat waiting, half buried in snow. It weighed more than the jeep itself. "It won't move," muttered one of the officers. "It'll break the hitch," but Victor only nodded to the driver. "Try it." The chain went taut. The jeep's tires spun once caught and began pulling. Inch by inch the gun lurched forward, its wheels grinding through ice. The crowd fell silent, except for the growl of the engine and the creak of straining metal. When the gun cleared the rise and rolled onto level ground, a low whistle escaped someone's lips. Zhukov turned to Victor. "How much power does it have?" 60 horsepower, Comrade Marshal. Zhukov raised an eyebrow. "Only 60, our trucks have twice that." Victor smiled faintly. "And half the will to live." For a long moment, Zhukov said nothing. Then he walked toward the jeep, his boots crunching on the frozen earth. He stopped beside it, resting his gloved hand on the warm hood. The engine idled softly beneath his palm. "You know," he said quietly, almost to himself, "this thing doesn't need medals or speeches." He looked up, eyes hard as steel. "It doesn't need to be worshipped. It only needs fuel." The words hung in the cold air, and something unspoken passed through the men, an acknowledgement that went deeper than pride or rivalry. Even the wind seemed to hold still. When the demonstration ended, the generals returned to their cars in silence. The jeep remained in the center of the yard, its exhaust drifting like breath. Victor stood beside it, unable to shake the feeling that he had just witnessed a moment of quiet revolution. The engineers gathered around, speaking in low tones. Pavel, the youngest of them, finally broke the silence. "Comrade Andreev," he said, "are we supposed to be proud or ashamed?" Victor looked at him for a long time before answering. Both, he said, proud that we can recognize what works, ashamed that it isn't ours. That night, Kubinka was restless. The corridors buzzed with quiet conversations, the clatter of typewriters, the rustle of papers stamped secret. Reports were written, rewritten, and sealed. Words like exceptional durability, superior mobility, mechanical integrity filled the pages. But between the lines lay something deeper, the realization that the Soviet industrial mind had met its mirror, and the reflection wasn't flattering. In the mess hall, soldiers replayed the day's trials with disbelief. It climbed the hill like it was nothing, one said, and pulled that cannon as if it were a sled, another added. They laughed, but it wasn't mockery. It was respect. Victor sat apart, staring at his notebook. The numbers, the angles, the talk readings, all of it meant less than the truth he had seen with his own eyes. This wasn't just engineering. It was philosophy forged in steel and gasoline, a faith in simplicity, in accessibility, in the ordinary man behind the wheel. The Americans had built a machine that trusted its driver. The Soviets had built machines that demanded obedience. He remembered Zhukov's words, "It doesn't need to be worshipped. It only needs fuel." That line replayed in his head like a sermon. Power stripped of ego, efficiency without ceremony. It was the opposite of everything his country's factories stood for. When the official summary reached the Kremlin, it bore Zhukov's personal remark at the end. The American vehicle demonstrates superior adaptability and minimal maintenance requirements. A machine that functions regardless of condition is a soldier's true ally. It was a rare admission from a man who almost never praised foreign equipment. The next morning, as dawn broke over Moscow, Victor walked out to the test field again. The jeep sat alone, half covered in snow, its olive frame outlined against the rising light. He brushed the frost from its hood and felt the metal's cold bite. Somewhere in the silence he thought he heard the hum of American factories thousands of miles away, producing hundreds more just like it, each one identical, dependable, alive. He realized then that this single machine had done more than prove American engineering. It had challenged the very soul of Soviet pride. When the driver turned the key, the engine came alive once more, steady and unbothered. Victor stepped back and watched as it drove across the field, leaving perfect tire tracks through untouched snow. Behind him, the world he knew of complexity, hierarchy, and perfection began to crack. The demonstration had been meant to measure a machine. Instead, it had exposed a truth that genius wasn't in how complicated something could be, but how many people could trust it without fear. And as the jeep disappeared beyond the rise, a faint smile crossed Victor's face. Somewhere deep inside, admiration and dread mixed into one single thought: they build for freedom, we build for control. For the first time, he understood that this little American machine wasn't just driving across snow, it was driving straight through history. Snow was still falling over Kubinka when the last of the data sheets came in. The jeep sat in the hangar half buried under tarps, its olive frame marked with grease pencils and fingerprints. The tests were finished. The results, however, refused to stay silent. For 2 weeks, the engineers had logged every mile, every repair, every stall. When they compared the numbers, the truth cut sharper than any report could soften. Soviet vehicles ran 2 days for every 8 they spent in repair bays. The jeep, after hundreds of kilometers of brutal terrain, had been down for only 3 hours, not for a broken part, but for an oil change. Victor stared at the charts laid across his desk. The ink was still wet, the smell of paper mixing with the scent of cold metal. He ran his hand over the column of numbers, as if touching a confession. It wasn't just the jeep that had performed better, it was everything the jeep represented. Around him, the hangar buzzed with subdued voices. Engineers huddled around tables, comparing notes, whispering in disbelief. "It shouldn't be possible," one said. "How can something so basic outperform everything we've built?" Another replied. "Maybe we've been building the wrong things." Victor said nothing. He picked up the final maintenance report. The handwriting was rough, but the words were clear. "They build machines for the man. We build men for the machine." That sentence hit him harder than any mechanical failure ever could. He thought back to the demonstration, the jeep pulling the cannon, crawling up the ice slope, surviving the frozen river without complaint. It wasn't just steel and oil. It was philosophy built into bolts and bearings. The Americans hadn't designed a vehicle. They had designed endurance. The Soviet way worshipped weight armor and precision complexity that demanded mastery. But mastery, Victor realized, was a kind of arrogance. The Jeep's brilliance lay in its humility. It made no demands. It didn't need perfection. It just worked. He opened the American manual that had come with the captured vehicle. The pages were thin, printed in simple English clear diagrams, short sentences. If the engine stalls, check fuel first. If no fuel, refill. If still no power, check ignition. Victor almost laughed. Their own manuals read like textbooks, dense, theoretical, written by men who had never turned a wrench. This one was written for soldiers who had no time to think. It wasn't just instructions. It was trust. That night, Victor gathered his team. The room was dim, a single bulb swinging overhead, casting shadows across tired faces. "Comrades," he began, his voice low but firm, "we've been taught that power comes from precision, that the more complicated a thing is, the greater it must be." He paused, holding up the manual. "But this," he shook the booklet gently, "is more powerful than any of our engines, because it was written for everyone." Silence followed. No one dared interrupt. He walked to the Jeep, still standing on the test floor. "Look at it," he said. "No armor, no luxury, no secrets. And yet it goes. Always. They build for the man who needs it. We build for the man who builds it. That's the difference." Pavel, the youngest, raised his hand slowly. "Then, what are we supposed to build now?" Victor looked at him for a long moment. "Something worth trusting," he said. The next morning, the official report was typed and sealed. It ran 50 pages, technical measurements, comparisons, graphs. But buried in the final summary under the section labeled Observations and Conclusions was a single handwritten note from Victor himself. "The Americans produce belief. We produce pride." That one line, small as it was, became the quiet truth no one wanted to admit. By the end of the week, the report reached Moscow. High-ranking officials read it behind closed doors, their faces tightening with every paragraph. The conclusion was undeniable. Reliability had defeated sophistication. The Americans didn't win through brilliance. They won through repetition, through standardization, through an unromantic, relentless focus on what worked. Factories could be bombed, machines destroyed, but the philosophy remained: keep it simple, make it last, teach anyone to use it. Back at Kubinka, Victor sat alone on the loading dock, watching snow fall through the grey light. In the distance, Soviet tanks lined up for transport to the front. Even from afar, he could hear the familiar coughs of misfiring engines, the groan of transmissions forced into gear. He'd once found that sound reassuring proof of effort, of struggle. Now it only sounded tired. He thought about the Jeep, quiet and efficient, its heartbeat steady like a living thing. He wondered how many of them rolled across Europe at that very moment, each one a promise kept. The thought filled him with an ache that felt both admiration and shame. Later that day, a visiting colonel stopped by. "You look troubled, engineer," he said. "You've made quite the discovery." "Yes," Victor smiled faintly. "Discovery implies something new," he said. "But what we found isn't new. It's what we forgot." The colonel frowned. "Forgot," Victor gestured toward the Jeep. "We forgot why machines exist, not to glorify the builder but to serve the one who depends on them." The colonel said nothing. He didn't need to. That evening, Victor returned to his office and opened his notebook. The pages were filled with numbers, torque values, temperature readings, all precise, all meaningless now. He turned to a fresh page and wrote one sentence: "Complexity is a refuge for fear, the fear of simplicity, exposing our inefficiency." He closed the notebook and leaned back, listening to the distant hum of engines preparing for war. In the following days, new directives came from Moscow: re-evaluate vehicle designs, study American efficiency, adapt production methods. But everyone knew it was too late to catch up. You couldn't copy simplicity overnight. It wasn't a formula, it was culture. The American factories that built these Jeeps didn't rely on miracles. They relied on trust between worker and machine, designer and driver. Every bolt that fit perfectly meant someone cared enough to make it right the first time. Every standardized part meant faith in the system, not the individual genius. In contrast, Soviet engineering had been built on struggle, on constant adjustment, on the belief that perfection required pain. Victor finally understood how wrong that was. Pain didn't make machines better. Understanding did. He thought of the soldiers on the front lines fighting in snow, mud, and hunger. They didn't need complexity. They needed something that started when you turned the key, something that would not betray them when everything else did. He stood by the jeep one last time before the next phase of testing began. The wind howled through the open doors, carrying snow into the hangar. He brushed frost off the hood and whispered, "You don't fight the war. You make sure others can." In that moment, the little American machine seemed to embody something larger than mechanics. It represented a nation's faith in its people, the belief that freedom and efficiency could coexist. That greatness didn't have to be heavy or loud. For the first time in his life, Victor felt envy, not for their technology, but for their clarity. He walked away from the hangar that night knowing the real revolution wasn't built from steel, it was built from the courage to make things simple. Outside, the snow had stopped. The wind fell quiet. Inside, the jeep remained silent, patient, unbreakable, a lesson carved into metal that no propaganda could erase. Victor knew it would take decades for his country to understand what that machine had already proven in one winter, that progress was not about building something stronger, but about building something that could be trusted by anyone, anywhere, every single time. Spring 1945. The war was ending, but its machines still carried the memories of every battle they had survived. Kubinka stood quiet, now no more engines roaring through the snow, no more generals watching from beneath fur hats. The jeep, once a captured curiosity, sat near the entrance of the proving ground, its paint chipped, its tires worn smooth, but its engine still alive. It had become something more than a vehicle. It was a relic of realization. Months had passed since Viktor Andreev had written his report. Copies of it had spread quietly through design bureaus, factories, and military institutes. Words like standardization, durability, and simplicity began appearing in memos that once glorified precision and perfection. A subtle revolution had begun, not on the battlefield, but in the blueprints. In Gorky and Moscow, Soviet engineers worked to build a new kind of vehicle, one that could be repaired with a wrench, not a miracle. They studied the jeep's measurements, its frame geometry, its engine balance. By late 1944, a prototype rolled out the GAZ-67, a Soviet-born descendant of the American idea. It was heavier, rougher, but it carried the same soul, a belief that true strength was endurance. Factories once obsessed with perfection now chased reliability. Welders were told not to polish their seams but to make them uniform. Assembly lines were redesigned for speed, not spectacle. The jeep had done what no speech could. It had humbled an empire. Victor stayed at Kubinka through the war's end. He watched the red banners rise, heard the cannons of celebration echo across Moscow, but his eyes always drifted back to that small olive machine. While tanks thundered through Red Square in the victory parade, the jeep sat in the corner of the yard, dusted with confetti from the nearby barracks. Its engine still started on the first turn. On May 9th, 1945 Victory Day, a group of young mechanics decided to drive it one last time. They cleaned the windshield, painted a red star on the door, and drove it toward the city. Victor followed behind in a staff car. As the convoy reached the parade route, crowds roared, waving flags, tossing flowers. The jeep rolled quietly past the massive tanks and artillery, unnoticed by most except for Victor. He saw in that moment everything the war had taught him, condensed into a single image, one small machine that had outlasted everything built to surpass it. It wasn't power that made it immortal. It was purpose. Later that evening, the jeep was parked outside the engineering command post, engine ticking softly as it cooled. Zhukov himself passed by, still in his parade uniform, medals gleaming in the light of the street lamps. He recognized it instantly, the same vehicle he had seen climb the icy slope months ago. He stopped, smiled faintly, and said to Victor, "So, it still runs?" Victor nodded. "Yes, Comrade Marshal, it always runs." Zhukov placed a hand on the hood, the metal still warm. "Then remember this," he said. "The weapons that win wars are not the ones that shine. They're the ones that start when you need them." Victor never forgot that line. After the war, as Europe rebuilt itself from ash and memory, the lessons of the Jeep spread far beyond Russia. In Germany, Japan, and even Britain, engineers studied American wartime production with the same mixture of awe and discomfort Victor had once felt. They found the same truth hiding beneath the bolts, that industrial power was not just the ability to produce, it was the wisdom to produce what people could rely on. Decades later, when the Cold War began, the new Soviet designs, trucks, tanks, aircraft, all carried the imprint of that winter at Kubinka. Simpler control systems, fewer moving parts, greater tolerance for error. They had learned, finally, that endurance was the highest form of intelligence. But the Jeep's real legacy wasn't in blueprints or factories. It lived in the people who drove it, soldiers, farmers, workers, all discovering that technology meant nothing if it could not be trusted. One afternoon, years after the war, Victor visited a small military depot outside Moscow. The snow had melted, leaving the ground soft and muddy. Rows of rusting vehicles lined the yard, relics of the struggle that had shaped a generation. Near the back, half covered by a tarp, sat the same Jeep. He recognized it instantly by the dent on the fender and the faded American star barely visible beneath layers of green paint. He climbed in, turned the key, and, as if time itself bowed in respect, the engine came alive. The same steady heartbeat, the same soft vibration beneath his hands. He laughed quietly, shaking his head. "You stubborn little thing," he whispered. "You never learned how to die." He drove it slowly across the yard, the smell of oil and old leather filling the air. For a moment, the world around him disappeared. No borders, no propaganda, no flags. Just man and machine bound by something simple and pure trust. When he parked, he sat there for a long time, listening to the idle hum. The sound reminded him of the soldiers who had first brought it in from Kursk, men who'd seen death, carried exhaustion in their eyes, and still marveled that a small foreign vehicle could survive what they couldn't. He realized then that the Jeep's endurance wasn't just mechanical, it was human. Machines break, empires fall. But the ideas that teach people how to endure those never die. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Victor wrote his final note in the margin of his old report. The Americans built a vehicle. We discovered a truth. Strength is not in steel, but in the hands that keep it alive. He closed the notebook and looked at the Jeep one last time. Its paint was peeling, its canvas roof torn, but it still waited, ready, obedient to the simplest command move. That night, a soft rain began to fall over Moscow, washing away the dust of war. Somewhere in the distance, engines started again, Soviet, American, German, all echoes of one shared inheritance, the knowledge that technology only matters when it serves the human spirit. And so the story came full circle. What began as curiosity on a frozen battlefield had become a philosophy etched into time. From wonder to doubt, from discovery to awakening, and finally to understanding, the circle was complete. The Jeep didn't just survive the war. It survived history, because in the end the greatest power was never the roar of engines or the strength of armor. It was something far quieter, the enduring heartbeat of reliability. And somewhere deep in the cold Russian night that heartbeat still echoed. The story of that little American Jeep did not end in the snow of Kubinka. It became a quiet monument to something far greater than machinery, a testament to the idea that endurance is the truest form of intelligence. Long after the factories went silent and the banners of victory faded, its lesson remained: power means nothing without reliability, and innovation means nothing without humanity. Viktor Andreev would later say that the Jeep was not a vehicle but a teacher, one that spoke in the universal language of function. It reminded engineers, soldiers, and nations that greatness isn't born from complexity or pride, but from the ability to keep going when everything else stops. When history remembers wars, it often counts the tanks, the guns, the empires. Yet somewhere beneath that noise, a small engine kept turning, steady, humble, undefeated. Because in the end, the true strength of any civilization lies not in what it can destroy, but in what it can sustain. And that Jeep, captured and studied in a world of iron and ice, proved a truth that would outlive every war. Steel may rust, but purpose endures.